Did both of you guys get a chance to go in and play with the WinForms a little bit, just kick it around at all for the homework?
I have a little bit before, but I was having trouble using like data sources from things that weren't like SQL Server.
Okay.
I've dealt with that before, but I was having trouble like populating it other ways.
Oh, okay. So using data sources to pull data from other things.
That aren't
SQL.
JDK,
Okay. All right. We'll get to that probably in later courses, but if that's something you're dealing with, maybe with like a project for work or something.
No,
Okay.
I mean, work we usually use SQL Server.
Oh, okay.
So.
Okay. I'll be sure to try to cover that though when we get to that point. So I can definitely do that. Chris, anything for you? Kicked it around?
Kicked it around, nothing too spectacular.
Okay.
Although I'm curious as to one of the things I did was save values to a delimited file.
Okay.
Then I want to redisplay them as a multifunctional array. Good for that, or what would be potentially the best option? Because I want to display one record and next display the next record.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and that kind of plays together with what Cassie was talking about with the data adapters and all of those things. There's a control under the toolbox, under the data section, that has there's a control that actually helps facilitate that from rocking from record to record. But then there's also, you can kind of wire it up yourself, so it's kind of up to you. So we can kick through, and I'm not going to get into that much detail, but if we get there, we get there, and that's cool too. Okay. So obviously you should know to start a new WinForm project, you go New Project, WinForms application at the top, and I will just call this Week 4 app. And you should have been presented with a basic WinForm, so nothing overly exciting. You have the toolbox located on the left side, which contains all of your controls. And it's pretty straightforward. It's a lot of just, grab a control, drop it on the form kind of thing. Nothing too unwieldy or surprising. This toolbox is broken into different segments. So if you're not familiar with that or notice that, you have your common controls, which are your buttons, your radio buttons, your text boxes, your list boxes, all of those things. But you can collapse this and you have additional options, different segments of the toolbox. These are all containers. And again, all the controls are the same, so you can drag a container, a panel out onto this form. You can drop controls inside of that, and then once you do that, then if I can grab hold of it, they all move as a unit together. So, menus and toolbars, which we'll cover probably more so in the next hour, depending on how time permits, allow you to snap those components onto your form. Data, which is kind of what you guys were referring to. So you have your binding navigator, which is that piece that allows you to navigate from record to record. You have a binding source, a data grid view, and then a data set. Under the data section, some of those are controls that appear on the form, and some of them are kind of under the hood controls. So they look like controls to you in the design mode, but really they're there to serve a supplemental function. So normally you would take something like a data set and you would create a data set, you would fill it with data, and then you would bind it to a binding navigator, for example, or to a data grid view. So you're actually taking that data set worth of data, which is, if you want to think of it as a database that lives in memory, that's essentially what a data set is. That's what that term data set is in the .NET framework. You can take that and kind of do a offline version of a database, have all those tables in there, and then connect it and be able to present and show. Under components, I've always struggled with how best to describe this section because it's a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's a lot of what I like to think of as kind of like the classic components that you would use in a WinForms app. So things like serial port connections or spinning up independent processes. You have pieces like image lists, file system watcher. Some of these are pieces that live within the framework, and Microsoft basically provides you a drag and drop control to kind of implement those within a WinForm. And it has properties, dialogues, and all those things just like you would expect from a regular control. After that, you have a printing section, so it helps you facilitate printing. You'll notice in here you have things like print preview dialogues and print documents, and we'll get into those in a later week. And then dialogues is the last piece, so all of those standard dialog boxes that you see, such as open and save and color picker and font picker, those are all controls that you simply just drag onto your form, and they're pre-built for you, so you don't have to go through the painstaking task of building those and implementing all that functionality. It's already pre-packaged for you. So, oh, that's not what I intended to do. So with a form itself, as with all the controls, a form has some basic functionality, and it's very reminiscent to what you would see in like a Microsoft Word with dragging clip art or text box onto a form. You can drag and resize the form itself. You actually have properties, so you can right-click on the form and go Properties, and you'll get a Properties dialog box that comes up. I'm going to go ahead and pin that. And each control within your WinForms app has a full collection of properties. These properties are the same properties that we learned about last week that you can create and apply to your objects. So a control is truly nothing more than a class. So make that connection in your mind, that all that these controls are special classes that are pre-populated or preloaded inside of the .NET framework. They inherit from a special class, base class, called control that lives under the system.windows.forms namespace. And I'll go through and show all of that as we get into it. A form itself is a control, which then means it's a class. So you have, that whole kind of dynamic that goes on there. They're all one and the same. All of these controls have properties. Most of them have some kind of methods, and most of them have events. And the events are really the key piece to interacting with these controls on the form. And from a few of the projects I kicked around, or a few of the homework assignments I kicked around, it seemed like everybody at least understood the gist or what the potential is there. So to demonstrate it real quick, what I'll do is I'll grab a button, I'll drag it out on the form. I'll also grab a text box and drag it out here on the form. I'll resize this box, and I'll just place this button here underneath it. If you right-click or just show focus on any one control, let me lock that. So as you go from control to control, this properties dialog box is context sensitive, so it will change and shift as you go from control to control. You also have a drop down here of all the controls on your form. Sometimes you get a really complex form that has a lot of layers and it's kind of nested. It gets a little tricky to just go in and click on a control. So using the drop down is sometimes helpful as well. If I click on the button, there's a default property that's associated with this properties box, and it's always the one that the properties box will automatically take focus to. And in this case, it's the text property for this button. So I'm going to just change the text to say click me, which will then change the text of the button to also say click me. Each control also has a name, and in here it's designated in parentheses. This name is the name of the instance variable of this control. So when you drag a control onto a form, think about it through code. What's happening is that Visual Studios is declaring a variable for you that is of type button. So it's doing button space, and then in this case it calls it button1 and adds that to the code behind of this form. And I'll actually show you that code right here. So what you'll see here is you've got the form.cs, which is the form itself. It's just a CS file, just like program.cs that we dealt with in the command line. What's unique about it is that it inherits a base class called form. So if I jump into the form.cs for a moment, you'll notice that here is the basic template of the code behind of this form. So you have a visual representation in the designer, and then you have a code representation, which is actually what the designer is reading when it implements the design view. Now you'll notice here that you don't have all of those additional properties or variables there, such as the button and the text box. They don't show up in this form1.cs. The reason is that you actually have a separate .cs file that is the designer, where the designer keeps all of those variables and properties and event wire-ups and all of those things. So if we go into form1.designer.cs, let me scroll down here, you'll see that there's two private variables called button1 and textbox1. One is of type button, one is of type textbox. If I go back to my design, go to the properties of this button, and I change its name from button1 to btn click me, hit enter, I then can jump back to the design and notice that it renamed my variable for me. So those are the same thing. So again, what happens is that when you're in the design mode, this mode, Visual Studios is actually subcompiling and reading this code to generate this view. Yeah.
If you wanted to, could you start off in a console program and then call in a form and go back and forth if you wanted to?
Technically, you could. It is doable. There's some interesting mechanics that happen within a console application, or rather I should say that really happen within a WinForms application that you'd have to replicate. If we jump into the programs.cs, you'll notice this is what has to happen. Is you have to take the application, enable visual styles, and then set the compatibility text rendering, and then application.run, which is the piece that kicks off that WinForms application, it launches a new form, which is Form 1. Form 1 is our form. So if you were to do this within a command line app, these 3 steps, you could do it.
Because in Java, we had to make some kind of tic-tac-toe game, and then we had to have a console printout of all the moves that were made.
Oh, okay. So you want to go the other way with it.
What do you mean?
But you talked about having the console app with the printout.
Yeah.
So you want to launch the Win app from within the console, and then have the console do the printout at the end?
Yes. Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. Yeah, so you could basically facilitate that using these mechanics.
Yeah, I probably never did. I was just curious.
So yeah, it is doable.
Okay.
Yeah. So inversely, we could come in here and call this txt info, and by doing that and saving it, we can come back to Form 1. It'll get a little finicky, which I don't recommend doing it, but what it's basically saying is that you have elements. Textbox 1 is either undeclared or was never assigned. So if we come back in here and we expand this section that says Form Designer, or Windows Form Designer generated code, we'll see in here that this is where the initialized components is called. Here's where Textbox 1 lives. We now call it txt_info. So it's saying this.txt_info down below equals new textbox. It then goes through and sets the location, where to draw the button, the name, the size, tab index, the text that appears inside of that, and then whether to use the visual style back color. Same time, you also have the textbox 1, which we're now calling txt_info. So I'm going to rename these. And there's the positioning, name, size, and tab index. So again, this is the instance variable of the text box. So if I drag 3 text boxes onto this form, I'm going to get 3 instance variables, all of type text box. They'll all just have a different name. So let me find, oh, there it is. There we go. So once I get my compiler errors fixed, I should be able to flip back and my form comes back. So if I go into my toolbox and I grab 3 more text boxes, flip back to my designer, I now have text box 1, 2, and 3. Generally, I don't recommend touching the designer file. Visual Studios obviously does its part of keeping that updated, but I wanted you to understand that, because what you'll find is as we start to wire up event handlers, if you go in and you delete the method that's wired up to an event handler, you'll probably get an error or a compiler exception, and that exception will exist inside of this designer file, and I'll show you a sample of that. So generally speaking, you'll be dealing, when you build a Windows form, you'll deal with the form, the designer, and then you'll deal with the code behind file, which is the code version of that file. I'm going to go ahead and just drop these 3 because they're not relevant right now. And what I'm going to have happen is have the click me, when someone clicks on the button, have it do something to the text box. So what I did is I double-click on the button. Double-clicking on that button tells Visual Studios to do a few things. It says to take this button, find the default event, which is click, and generate a method that matches the event handler signature. And it takes that method and places it inside of the form1.cs, or the form's code behind side. If you notice here that it automatically adds these attributes, that's part of the event handler signature. And the event will not be handled correctly, or you'll get a compiler error if this signature does not match the way the event is defined. And I'll get into more of how you create events and what that means and what that looks like as we get through things. But just understand that that's what this is. This is the signature, the method signature, or the function signature for that event. So the double click generates this method, and inside of this method is the action that you want to occur when you click the button. Okay, pretty straightforward. In this case, we're going to take txtinfo.text. Text is the property of the text box. And we're going to set it equal to datetime.now.toShort to, we'll just do toString. If we mouse over, txtinfo is a text box. It's a property of form1. That's all kind of explained inside of this little pop-up. Text is a property. It takes a string. It does both get and set, so you could also retrieve from whatever's been typed into that text box, store it in a local variable, or you can set a value to that text box, replacing whatever text is inside the box with the date in this case. So if we run this, it'll launch the form. If I click the button, it then takes that and sets the text property to date time. Nothing overly fancy. If I type in a value in here, click the button, it'll replace. So if I keep clicking every second, I'll get an updated time. A listing of all the events is located in the properties dialog box. So you have basically 2 toggles that you probably want to keep an eye on. You have the properties themselves, and then this one that's a lightning bolt is the events. So this button not only has a click event, but it has a drag drop event, a drag enter event, enter, so when the enter key is pressed, when this button has focus, what does it do? There's a key down, a key press, a key up. There's mouse down, mouse up, mouse click, resize, size changed, text changed. Some of these are just common events that are inherited from the base control class, and some of them are specific to the button. They were implemented specifically for the button. Text box similarly has events as well. Text changed. A lot of the common ones are text changed. the key down, key press, and key up. And usually those are for when you're trying to capture or limit the input on a text box. So for example, if you only want to allow numbers to be entered into a box, you can use the key press event. And I'll just show you an example here. We'll say if, so what we want to do is say if the key pressed is not a number, don't display. That's what we want it to do. So that is something of if key pressed is, and I'm just going to do this for now, not equals to 0, ignore the key. I think it's yelling because of the comment. So how do we capture that and determine what key was pressed? That's the trick. These event args, you'll notice with the button, it's just event args. Every event that is within the .NET framework that is tied to a control, specifically, has event args. Event args is a base class that can be implemented, and the base args allow the caller of the event, which in this case is our program calling the click event, to receive information from the control itself. So let's talk about a concrete example. The key press event args allows the text box to tell us, the programmer, what key was put inside the text box, or what key was pressed to enter into the text box. So you could go around it kind of a haphazardly way and say, let them type the key into the text box, grab the last character off the end of the key press, see what it is, and then do your logic. Instead, the text box actually has basically a built-in mechanism to say, I'm going to give you whatever key was pressed. I'm going to do you a favor and help you with that. So key pressed event args, that class itself has properties to help give us information. So if we reference it as E dot, there's the key char, or the character. So we can say if it's not equal to 0, I'm going to do it this way just because it's easier to read. So if it's not equal to 0, then we can say handled, and this gets or sets a value indicating whether the key press event was handled. I believe we set this to false. I always get it confused. Else we'll say E handled equals true. We'll test this. Either this will make us only be able to put zeros in, or it won't allow zeros. Okay, it doesn't allow zeros. So we want to say that this was handled. So we handled it internally. So now it only allows zeros. Yeah, so if the key is not equal 0, then yes, we handled it, we took care of it. We're basically omitting the key from being pressed. Otherwise, allow the key to be pressed. So, slick, simple. So you could put in here a regular expression that would basically check to see, is that character an alpha or numeric or whatever you wanted to do to kind of simplify that logic instead of having a whole array of if statements. You could also go as far as converting the character to its integer value, look at the ASCII value of it, and determine if that ASCII value is between a certain range. That's probably an equally easy way to do it. And it basically runs through this line of code, or this chunk of code, every time a key is pressed. So if I put a breakpoint here and run it again, I'll hit D. I keyed in D. It'll say that it was handled internally, and go on. Obviously no D is entered. If I hit a 0, the key is 0. And then it goes ahead and says, let it be handled by the text box. And the text box outputs a 0. Pretty straightforward. Same thing we could do here. We can start to retrieve values. So we can say if txtinfo.text equals 000. We can push out a message box, basically doing a basic announcement. So if you've done any HTML, JavaScript work, you've called probably something like alert, and it pops up a little dialog box. Same concept. You have a control that, or I'm sorry, I take that back. You have a class that it basically functions as a utility class, and it has a series of static methods. So there's a class called MessageBox, and you don't create an instance of MessageBox. You simply say dot show, and dot show. The show is a static method that has 21 potential overloads. So if you notice that there's that 1 to 21 listed in the pop-up, if I arrow down, you'll see there's all kinds of different overloads. And I'll go through a handful of them in a minute, but we'll say you entered the secret password. Oop. Still got that breakpoint on. So DDD does nothing. 000. I'll just do one. Oh, it won't even let me backspace. That's clever. So if I click me, you enter the secret password. If I add an additional 0, we get nothing. So you can do those types of logic things as well. So that's the basic mechanics of how you go through building a WINS form. I mean, it's nothing flashy, it's nothing super amazing, but those are the mechanics that you'll run into in just about any scenario. Those are your basic mechanics. Some of the more sophisticated controls... Actually, let me show you one more thing before I go there. So let's say I decided that I don't want to handle that text change event, or that key down event, key press event. What's it called? Key press event on that text box. And I say, I don't need to do that. Delete. And I'm going to run it. I get a compiler error. I'll say, no, I want to see what the error is. And you'll probably run into this at one point or another, and it'll say something to the effect of form 1 does not contain a definition of txtinfo_keypress, which is the name of that method I just deleted, and no method extension for that is accepting the first argument of type WIN form 1. Could be found. If I double click on this, it'll take me to that line. Now you notice what it did is it brought me into the designer. This, ignoring specifically the last piece, this line is what I term and is often termed as the event wire-up. That's the syntax to wire up or link a method to an event. So what does that linking do, and what does that mean? When a key is pressed on the text box control will always trigger this event, key press. Always. Regardless if someone is listening to the event or not, it will attempt to trigger this event. What we want to do is we want to tap in and actually listen to the event. And to listen to the event, what you have to do is you have to declare an event handler. This event handler has a specific signature to it. If I do an F1 on this, jump out to MSDN, the event handler signature says that it's a void function, and that function should have object sender key press event args e is the signature of that method, the parameters for that method. If you notice, if I jump back here, do a Control Z, this is a void method, and the parameters are object sender key press event args e. This method matches the signature of the event handler. what this event handler takes is it takes what it's basically defining is a function that is void, has a void return, object, key press event args. If you're familiar with C++, and I'm not sure how, I don't know if they do this in Java, but basically you have this concept of a delegate or a function pointer. And basically what it is you're generating a variable that references a function. Alright, so if that totally blew you away, you'll see an example of it later. But the idea is that you basically define the function signature, void, object, key press event args, as our parameters. And you're saying, I want to be able to take a function and store it in a variable. Which really isn't storing the function in a variable like we think, it's acting as a pointer to that function. You're basically giving it another name. And I'll show you an example of that as well today so that you can maybe get a better sense of how that works. Long and short of it is that this event handler is a class. It requires you to pass to its constructor a function, and that function must match and meet this signature of a void function that takes in an object and system key press event args as parameters. txtinfo underscore key press, which lives here, which is our event handler, meets those requirements. What happened is when I deleted it, is that this line is no longer valid because it can't reference this function. That's why I got the compiler error. Simply delete this, save, and everything will compile as normal. Alternatively, if I bring that line back, if I come back into the designer and I look at the properties, oh wait, let me save. Okay. Okay, it apparently didn't bother to keep it in this view, but it kept it here. So I'd have to go back a lot further, but long and short of it is you'll normally want to delete that line or at least comment it out if you run into that scenario. Okay. So let's say, for example, you wanted to put two controls on a form, two buttons. And maybe this is a really long form with lots of text boxes on it. Holding down the control key, by the way, and dragging will duplicate. Okay, so we have a form with all kinds of text boxes on it. Presuming that this could be scrollable, kind of like you would think of a web page, you had a need to put both buttons at the top and the bottom. Ideally, you want the event handler for that button to be the same event handler for this button. So how would you go about doing that? In the designer, we can find button 1. We can copy this wire up, paste it here, and change this variable from btn click me, which is the top button, to button 1. So now what's happening is that btn click me underscore click is assigned to both btn click me dot click event and button 1 dot click event. So both instances, both variables, button 1 and btn click, whenever they're clicked, we'll call that click event. When they're called, what's happening is that this method is getting invoked. It's getting executed. It's getting called. And it's being passed in that object. And those key press... Or I'm sorry, these are just basic event args because it's a click. So let's look at it in a little more detail and see what's actually happening here. So if we... And this line obviously won't work anymore. Or, yeah, it'll be fine. So if we put a breakpoint here, play. If I click the button, the event args are actually mouse event args, but they inherit from event args. So without going in this way and looking at it, we have no details as to what it is. But we could cast these to mouse event args, which will give us what button was clicked, how many clicks happened, what was the location on the button when it was clicked. But equally important is this object sender. The sender is actually providing us which button was clicked. Who was the sender of this information? In this case, it's the button that says click me, which if we keep drilling into these base classes with their properties, we'll eventually stumble upon the name property, btn click me. Go ahead and continue this to run. If I click button 1, the sender is now button 1. All the way down here. There's the name. The event args again are actually those. I can't make it. There we go. Those mouse event args. So when I clicked the button this time, I clicked it at X40Y9 on the button. So the upper left-hand corner of that button, think of it as a coordinate plane. That's at pixel 9 down, 40 in. One click.
Why is it so important to have all your buttons on the same listener?
You don't want to, unless you want both buttons to do the same thing.
Okay.
So if you have two buttons on your form that should be functioning and acting the exact same way,
Okay.
then wire them both together so that you don't have to copy code between two event methods.
Okay.
So if I didn't do that, what would happen is I'll come back here, I'll double click on this button, it'll generate for me another method, another event handler. I then have to copy this code into here, and then every time I would make a revision, I'd have to make sure that I copy it or do it in both places.
The first time you said, I want to have both these buttons the same listener. I just didn't know what the reasoning was.
Yeah, so it's just for deduplication of code. So if you wanted this to do something different, so having some different value or doing a different check, then you could say 000. Oh, let me get rid of the breakpoint. You entered the secret password. This one obviously won't say anything. If I do 4, now this one says you entered the password and this one doesn't. So you've got two event handlers now listening to the buttons independently. The forms themselves also have properties. So if I click on the form, go to the properties dialog, it has properties and events. So you can have something occur when you click on the form itself. You can have something occur when you drag the form around. The text change properties and some of the other ones, they function, but they function in very interesting ways. So however the form was designed, I haven't gone through all of them obviously, but most of them do wire up to something, but whatever triggers them varies from control to control. Some of them are obvious, some of them aren't so much. The text property for a form is the form title. So when I change that, it updates the title above. There's some other interesting little pieces that you can do to change your form. You can set the opacity, so you could set it at 75%. And then when you run the application, the form is semi-transparent. You can have it show in the taskbar true or false. That one's kind of fun. So your app runs, but it doesn't give you an icon down below. The maximize box, minimize box, you can enable or disable them. So if you don't want the ability to maximize the form, you can turn that off, which then makes it disabled, but you can still minimize and close. There is an option even more specific where you can actually exclude it. And I don't recall what that property was. I forget the property, but there is one that you can do that. So you have a number of different properties in here that you can manipulate and use. They're pretty nice. I'm trying to think what else was there. So, window state, you can have the default state of the window when it opens to be minimized or maximized. So depending on your application and how it functions. If you're maybe building some sort of a dashboard or control panel that you always want to open in a maximized state, so it'll open full screen for that user, you can set it to open maximized, and then it will open full screen. Something that is nice, let me put this back to normal for a moment, is with your controls, you have options of alignment and how they're aligned on the form. That's under the dock property. So traditionally, when you would put a form on a put a control on a form, if you wanted to handle kind of that free-flowing aspect of your form, so as it minimized and maximized controls, resizing and fitting and things like that, you would have to handle the resize event of the form and then go through and do a series of calculations and make sure that the controls moved fluidly across the form. With docking, you can take a control and you can dock it to one side or another. So if you always want this button to be on the top, you always want this button to be on the bottom, you can do that, refresh, and no matter what size I make this form, these controls will always stay. And as I make it wider, they'll expand with the form, and so forth. You can do that with text boxes and other elements as well. So it's kind of a nice thing when you start running into scenarios where you want to have that level of control. And if you don't want it, you hit none, it snaps back to where it was. Similarly, you can use the anchor, so you can anchor things to the top right. You can anchor to the, in this case, we'll anchor bottom right. And then when we run and we resize the form, they'll float with wherever their anchor points are. Okay. Any questions? Anything that wasn't clear? I went too fast? Okay. Would we like to take a 5-minute break before I get into toolbars and things like that? And then we'll come back and probably go for about another 30 minutes and we should be done. Okay?